Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories. In these stories, one man, dozens of men, and thousands of men had the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and as a result, what happened to them is truly horrific. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. As Scary Interesting has gotten more popular, as you might imagine, I've naturally become a little more concerned about privacy and security, especially anytime I'm working away from my home office and on public Wi-Fi. That's when a VPN is basically essential. A VPN encrypts your internet connection, creating a secure tunnel between your device and the web. This protects sensitive data like passwords and banking information while on public Wi-Fi. It also routes your connection through one of their 4,500 servers all over the world, making it appear as though you're browsing from that region. Beyond the security this provides, this allows you to access location-specific deals and content. Like, for example, as a Canadian, streaming services typically only show the Canadian catalog, but with Surfshark, you can access content from any region where they have servers. This also extends to all sorts of price deals, letting you find better offers based on location. Maybe the best part, though, is that even with their most basic plan, you can use it on an unlimited number of devices. This means you can keep your entire household protected with a single subscription. And beyond just their VPN, Surfshark also offers an alternative ID system which generates a brand new identity and email to use online. This means you don't have to use your personal info for sketchy websites. Not only will this minimize the spam you receive, but it can also prevent your data from ending up in the wrong hands like data brokers during data breaches. So right now you can get 4 extra months free of Surfshark VPN by going to my link in the description or by going to https://surfshark.com/scare. And they also have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a try. With that said, let's get into today's video. China's early history before its eventual unification was full of brutal infighting, especially during what is known as the Warring States period. This was a period where dozens of rival kingdoms fought for control. Eventually, though, one state managed to conquer the rest and unify China for the first time. Its new ruler then set up standardized laws, currency, writing, and infrastructure, but his rule was simultaneously brutal. Books were burned, scholars were executed, and anyone who pushed back faced harsh punishment. As the resentment toward his rule grew, so did the number of attempts on his life. This led to him being terrified of death, so he went searching for immortality. Ironically, this ended with him poisoning himself with a so-called eternal life potion. After he died, his son took over, but he was basically a figurehead controlled by officials from his father's reign, and his poor leadership sparked rebellion across the country. This was especially so from one eastern state that already hated the empire for its past defeats. Eventually, this rebellion came to a head at a battle in a town called Julu. The rebels were starving and surrounded and seemingly on the brink of defeat. However, when their leading general arrived with reinforcements, he ordered his troops to burn their remaining supplies, telling them the only way they'd eat again was by defeating the imperial army. This apparently worked, and despite being massively outnumbered, the rebels fought with such intensity that nearby rebel forces who had been watching from the sidelines jumped in to help. The imperial side then suffered enormous losses and actually retreated. Their commander begged the emperor for reinforcements, but the emperor refused, convinced his own general was plotting against him. So, cut off, surrounded, and with half his 400,000 troops gone, the general had no choice but to surrender. This was a turning point that pushed the already fragile empire to the brink of collapse, and left 200,000 imperial forces in the hands of the rebels. But although the rebels' victory was improbable, the surrender of that many imperial troops created problems. Since the rebels had destroyed all their own food, they only had the food of the imperials they captured. However, they also had to feed all 200,000 extra men. This caused the rations to quickly be depleted, and soon enough the situation would be dire. So, after holding the prisoners for a short time, the rebel general came up with a plan. Gathering up the prisoners, the rebels marched the imperial prisoners south to the countryside outside Julu. Once there, they were ordered to dig a massive hole. This was a significant undertaking by an equally significant force, as 200,000 troops used their hands and shovels to move the earth of the countryside. When the digging was complete, the hole supposedly measured more than 1,300 feet long and 820 feet wide, and it was more than deep enough to prevent any of the prisoners from entertaining the idea of climbing out. At this point, the rebels surrounded the pit as the Imperials looked on curiously from below them. On the next command, the rebels released a barrage of spears, arrows, knives, and swords into the pit. As this continued, some of the rebel soldiers also began to fill the hole back in with dirt the prisoners had removed. Screams and shrieks replaced the peacefulness of the countryside as the men in the pit were covered or were injured by the many projectiles. At some point, every single soldier around the pit took up the effort of refilling the hole. As dirt piled up, their screams were first muffled, then silenced as those who hadn't been killed by weapons succumbed to being buried alive. Contrary to some sources that state that the burial site was discovered during a railway construction in 1912 when many bones were discovered during excavation, the actual site hasn't been fully verified. Today, any potential area is simply surrounded by lush crops, tall trees, and beautiful flowers, betraying very little about the dark and horrifying events that took place there. As the story goes, an old ranch hand named Bob Womack discovered gold in Poverty Gulch in Cripple Creek, Colorado, all the way back in 1890. Like most savvy prospectors, he tried to keep the lucrative find to himself, but word eventually spread. And by the following year, the Cripple Creek gold rush was in full swing. Before long, the pristine landscape was covered with vertical mine shafts, some of which reached nearly 1,000 feet into the earth below. One of the first holes in the ground was the Mary McKinney mine, and at the time, most of the mines were small-scale, owned by individuals or small groups. As a result of this, chipping away with picks and shovels inside dark shafts was tedious, dangerous, and painstakingly slow. This caused mines to regularly go out of business or change hands numerous times as owners admitted they were working themselves to death and barely breaking even, or worse yet, losing money. 70 years after gold was found in Cripple Creek, Wayne Tease was born in Pennsylvania, and although he didn't know it yet, he would eventually be drawn out west. Growing up, he had a love for the outdoors, and according to his mother, he even dreamed about striking it rich as a prospector. So when he was 23 years old, he and his fiancée moved to Colorado Springs to turn that dream into a reality. Wayne quickly found work as a house painter, and the job took up most of his time during the relatively mild spring and summer months. When he wasn't working though, one of his favorite pastimes was exploring the high country. Wayne had always been drawn to the abandoned mines. There was just something alluring, almost romantic about them. Wayne apparently often thought about the grizzled old prospectors who worked the earth decades before. On Sunday, April 27, 1986, he and a friend drove to Cripple Creek, about 40 miles southwest of Colorado Springs. From the parking area, there was a moderately challenging but scenic 2.5-mile hike to Poverty Gulch. The weather was also good, and before long, they were standing among the gaping mine openings they'd been looking forward to exploring all week. For whatever reason, Wayne and his friend eventually decided to split up, maybe simply because they could cover more ground before they had to head back. But what happened next will always be a bit of a mystery. Sometime later, Wayne's friend turned around and headed back toward the Mary McKinney mine. At some point, he figured Wayne just wandered off like he usually did and then catch up sooner or later. Soon enough, though, he became increasingly worried when Wayne didn't show up. He called his friend's name over and over at the top of his lungs, but Wayne never answered. As panic set in, he came to the horrifying realization that Wayne might have entered one of the mine shafts. As soon as that thought crossed his mind, he hiked back to the vehicle, drove to the nearest payphone, and called 911. Search and rescue personnel began arriving later that afternoon. Back in Pennsylvania, Wayne's mother got the phone call that can only be described as every parent's worst nightmare. The information was spotty, but according to the caller, Wayne might have fallen into an unprotected vertical mine shaft. The following day, the Bureau of Mines and Land Reclamation sent a team with a sensitive camera that was fixed to a tether and lowered into the dark shaft. Sources vary on how deep the camera went, but shortly thereafter, its light illuminated Wayne's lifeless body somewhere between 800 and 1,000 feet down. That day, he was wearing white painter's pants and a t-shirt, both which had absorbed significant amounts of blood. The rescuers attempted to recover Wayne's body for 5 long and ultimately unsuccessful days. After that, the effort was called off because the risk of injury and additional loss of life was just too great. When recovery efforts were finally abandoned, Wayne's family held a quiet service beside the shaft while still hoping his body might someday be recovered for a proper burial. Unfortunately, every attempt to reopen the effort was blocked by bureaucracy, and when that fight failed, they pushed successfully to have the mine sealed and declared a burial site. It's still not entirely clear what happened that day, but it's thought that shortly after they separated, Wayne walked toward the Mary McKinney mine shaft and peered over the edge into the dark abyss below. He may have gotten distracted or was simply enamored with the mysterious mine and stepped a little too far. Whatever the case, he seems to have lost his footing and then fell into the gaping mine shaft that plunged nearly 1,000 feet into the bowels of the earth. John Henry Patterson had only been in the South Kenyan region of Tsavo for a few days when he started to hear the stories. As a lieutenant colonel in the British Army, John was assigned to a bit of an unusual post in Africa. He was to take over and lead the already underway construction of a railroad that connected Uganda with the Indian Ocean. This included oversight of 2,000 to 3,000 Indian and African workmen spread over an area of about 8 miles. That number, however, had mysteriously started to dwindle as workmen disappeared in the middle of the night. Strangely, it's not that they were quitting the incredibly backbreaking work. Instead, it was something, according to the workmen, that was taking them. Now, as with much of Africa, predators of all sorts populated the Tsavo region, but to the workmen, this was the work of the supernatural. According to some who had witnessed the disappearances, a shape-shifting demon was tormenting the camps under the cover of darkness. To others, this was the manifestation of a departed native chief who was upset that the railway was being built through his country. John, however, didn't quite buy the stories. It was a sad fact of life in railroad camps that animosities grow as some men make more money than others. So what was more likely in his mind was that the missing workmen were the victims of foul play. About 3 weeks after his arrival, John was startled awake around dawn by some of the other officers. He hadn't even had a chance to fully wake up before one of them launched into a frantic story about one of the site's best workers, Ungin Singh, being taken during the night. Since Ungin was making more money than most of his fellow workers, it reinforced his belief that his disappearance was the result of jealousy and greed, but that impression didn't last long. John was then led to the tent where Ungin disappeared just hours before and examined the area. There, he found strange marks around the tent and even a path in the sand created by Ungin's heels as he was dragged out of camp. John then met with one of Ungin's tent mates who was visibly shaken by what he had witnessed. The story he told and the evidence John would soon come upon would make him doubt his theory that the workmen themselves were behind the disappearances. John quietly listened as the man went through what happened. At around midnight, the workman was awakened by the tent door suddenly opening. A moment later, he heard Ungin scream out, "Let go." The worker was completely frozen in fear as he watched Ungin struggle against what had grabbed hold of him before this unseen force dragged him away. The others sharing the tent were awakened by the disturbance, but they too were so afraid that they couldn't move as Ungin's desperate cries for help echoed through the camp. Then there was nothing but the chilling silence until the sun rose. After speaking with Ungin's tent mate, John followed the tracks that had been created by his heels. Every so often, it appeared as whatever had dragged him from the tent stopped before continuing to pull him into the brush, as evidenced by these small pools of blood along the path. When John entered a clearing, though, he was met with a scene that was almost beyond words. The sand in the clearing was covered in blood, and all that remained of Ungin were a few bones, bits of flesh, and his decapitated head. John then approached it, and the image of the look frozen on his face was forever seared into his mind. His eyes stared blankly with his brow furrowed into a terrified expression. The scene made it clear to John that the camps weren't being tormented by devils, demons, or spirits. This was the work of very real and very dangerous lions. Now, if you know anything about African predators, you're probably aware that lions don't often make prey out of humans. In fact, lions are more often scared by humans as a result of generations of humans hunting them. So if lions suddenly start to hunt and attack humans, there are likely several factors at play. One of the top reasons for man-eating behavior among lions is some kind of disturbance in the ecosystem that affects their usual food sources. In 1898, it was known that there was an outbreak of a condition called rinderpest, or cattle plague, which decimated many of the animal populations in the region. This also just so happened to correspond with a practice that caused the lions to develop a taste for human flesh. The Tsavo region was a popular route for caravans traveling to and from Mombasa, transporting people as part of the slave trade. At the time, a disease known as sleeping sickness was rampant, and as people in these caravans started to die, their bodies were left behind. Scavengers and predators started feeding on these, and the lions in the area would often win out against other animals. But in any case, the night after Ungin was killed, John climbed a tree near the tent he was taken from with a shotgun and planned to keep watch. If he caught sight of any of the lions, he was going to shoot to kill, but it was almost as if the lions knew he was waiting for them. Just as John was settling onto a tree branch for the night, the silence around the camp was shattered by the roar of the lions. Each roar seemed like it was coming closer and closer to John, so he readied himself, aiming his gun in the direction of the sound until the roaring suddenly stopped without any sight of them. It was quiet again for an hour or two as John waited in the tree, but once again it was disturbed. This time it was the sound of an attack, but it wasn't coming from John's camp. It sounded like the lions had chosen another camp about half a mile away where no one was watching them. Hours later, morning came with confirmation of another victim taken and eaten by the lions. So John decided to spend another night keeping watch on the tree, only this time he tied a goat to the trunk, hoping this would entice the lions. Around midnight, however, John heard the unmistakable distant cries of another lion attack at a different camp. Because of the way the railroad construction was being done across miles-long swaths of land, the lions had what amounted to a buffet line. They could literally pick and choose which camp to attack each night. As you might imagine, by this point, terror had broken out among the workers, and they started quitting in droves. Those who did stick around were so desperate for work and for money, they had to live with the constant threat of being the next lion victim. But then something unexpected happened. Despite the line of camps, the attacks abruptly stopped. For a handful of months, not a single worker heard or saw any sign of the animals that had been stalking them. Rather than fall into a false sense of security, though, John and the workers used this time to prepare if they came back. From the moment he arrived in Savo, he kept a detailed journal of each day's events, and during the breaks in the attacks, he compiled all the information he had on the lions. He knew that these were Savo lions, which are different from their Serengeti cousins. The traditional image of a male lion includes a large, thick mane, but the Savo males grow extremely short and thin manes, if they grow a mane at all. This is thought to be because the Savo region is much hotter and drier than the Serengeti. Since water is such a scarce resource in the region, something seemingly as basic as a mane isn't practical. Then in terms of behavior, Savo lions also exhibit differences from Serengeti lions, which tend to travel in larger prides. These usually consist of up to 20 females and 2 or more males. Savo lions, though, generally keep 2 smaller prides that include only 1 male, since male Savo lions don't typically get along with one another. This information made the attacks even stranger to John, though, because he knew they were actually being carried out by the same 2 males, which he had seen by then with his own eyes. Despite all the time he spent gathering information, though, there was hope at John's camp that the lions had either moved on to another food source or, even better, were somehow dead. But soon enough, there was news of resumed attacks close to the camps. It was only a matter of time before the lions returned, and they did so in a much more aggressive way. In preparation for this possibility, several camps had built fences made of thorny vegetation and maintained large fires at night in hopes that all of this would deter the lions, but it was all for nothing. The Savo man-eaters, as they became known, easily jumped over the fences and didn't even flinch at the fires. More concerning, though, was that their taste for humans was becoming so strong that the attacks were happening literally every night. Not only that, but in the earlier attacks, only one of the lions went into the camp to snatch a victim. This time, though, both lions were coming to the camps together. The return of the lions once again caused a mass exodus of workers, this time to the point where construction on an important railway bridge came to a halt. And those that stayed on would have visceral reactions to the attacks. Anytime a scream was heard, the workers would all run from their tents to the trees, which they'd climb in excessive numbers. During one attack, a tree was apparently so crammed full of men it actually fell. But lucky for them, the lions were too busy eating one of the other workers to notice. Things eventually came to a head with the work stoppage on the railroad bridge. John wrote to the district officer named Mr. Whitehead about the problem with the lions and requested that he bring a number of his native soldiers to help protect the camps. Mr. Whitehead then boarded a train for Savo and was set to arrive at the station in the region around 6 p.m. on December 2nd. John sent someone to meet him and assist Mr. Whitehead to the camp, but not long after leaving, the man was seen running back toward John. With a look of complete terror on his face, the man told John that the train didn't arrive and there was a lion standing at the station. John was obviously in disbelief by this, so he went to investigate himself. When he arrived at the station, there was no sign of the lion, but he did speak with the station master and a signalman, who both confirmed it had been wandering around the station. This was such a concern that Mr. Whitehead's train was significantly delayed to the point that John doubted it was going to arrive at all that day. That night, John again took his post in a tree near the camp and waited quietly. Before long, he heard the growls and snarls of the lions nearby, but there was another distinct sound that accompanied them. It was the snapping and crunching of bone. John started imagining what the lions might be eating because he didn't hear any attacks at any of the other camps, and those were always loud and obvious. He came to the conclusion that the lions must have gotten a hold of a traveler who didn't know about the Savo man-eaters. Then, through the darkness, John spotted the source of the sound in the form of 2 sets of glowing eyes and slowly raised his shotgun and took aim. He then fired a shot, but it missed both lions, and to his surprise, they hardly reacted at all as they dragged their victim further into the brush and just continued their meal. As John went looking for them the next morning, he unexpectedly ran into Mr. Whitehead, who looked terrible. Before John could try to figure out what happened to him, Mr. Whitehead tore into him. As it turned out, his train had arrived the night before, and since there was no one to bring him there to the camp, he and his servant had to find their way through the desert in the dark of night. After the two trudged along by lantern for a while, one of the lions leapt out onto the 2 men. Both were knocked to the ground, and one of the lion's claws had badly cut Mr. Whitehead's back. He then pulled out his sidearm and fired at the lion, which briefly stunned it and caused it to back off. Almost as quickly, however, the lion pounced on his servant and dragged him away into the brush. What John heard overnight was the sound of Mr. Whitehead's servant being devoured. The attack on Mr. Whitehead was finally enough to bring more officers to the area, along with 20 armed professional Indian infantrymen. With reinforcements finally, John's hunt for these Savo man-eaters ratcheted up. He set traps and even attempted to lead several ambushes on the lions. Over the next few days, he'd get several shots off, but it wasn't until December 9th when John found the mark and killed one of the lions. Then, 3 weeks later, the second was tracked and killed, putting an end to the attacks on the workers in the railroad camps. In John's journal, he would estimate that the lions killed and ate 135 people, but recent research suggests that such a high death toll is unlikely. Instead, these studies suggest that the number of deaths caused by the two lions is more realistically between 28 and 31, although the reports do recognize that a death toll of up to 72 wasn't outside the realm of possibility. One of the lions from the tip of the nose to the end of the tail was apparently almost 10 feet or 3 meters long and took 8 men to carry back to camp. After both of the lions' bodies were at camp, John had them skinned and used them as rugs for 25 years. The skins were eventually sold to the Field Museum of Natural History, which reconstructed the lions. Both of these skins and the two lion skulls are still on display there. Because of the efforts to preserve them, modern technology has also been applied to answer long-standing questions about the man-eaters. Maybe the most interesting is a study that was released in the fall of 2024 that provided insight about the possible reasons the lions turned to man-eating behavior. As mentioned earlier, certain things about a lion's environment often needs to change in order for them to turn their attention to humans. One of the things that can have a strong influence on lions' hunting preferences is dental disease or injury. In examining the teeth of the lions, scientists determined that one of the lions was likely kicked in the face by a buffalo or zebra at some point, which caused severe dental trauma. Something like this could lead a lion to focus on slower, softer prey. Both lions were found to have tooth injuries, but one of them was definitely worse off than the other. Over time as well, these injuries and cavities collected months' worth of hairs the lions consumed as a result of their diet, and scientists were able to test a number of the samples from them. Results of the testing identified hairs from giraffes, oryx, waterbucks, wildebeests, zebras, and humans. It's also believed that the lion without significant tooth trauma was the main hunter, since the injured one likely couldn't hunt as efficiently. When lions attack prey, they generally target the soft tissues of the neck with their large canine teeth, but a lion with a tooth injury could potentially struggle to make puncture wounds. So, it's thought that the Savo sibling lions of 1898 might have turned to man-eating due to the relative ease of hunting humans and the high number of targets in the area. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.